All right. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and Brandon picked my plate up and said he just bought himself the right to ask a really stupid question. And I'm like, what's different than any other day, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about pasture renovation tonight, and I'll be here as late as you all want to stay and talk. Another extension agent on the other side of the lakes gave me this title. He said, I want you to talk about what you can expect in terms of grass from your pasture next spring. And if I could answer that question, I wouldn't be standing here, right? I'd be buying something on the stock market. So it's a tough question. And I think it kind of boils down to two things. And the first one is how that pasture was managed prior to the drought. So if I had a well-managed pasture prior to that drought, so I'm not overgrazing it, I'm stocked at a reasonable rate, I've got decent soil fertility, I'm going to be all right next spring, even though it was kind of dry this summer. Especially if I manage that pasture well during the drought. So when it gets dry, the worst thing that we can do on a farm is just open all the gates up. If we open all the gates up, those animals are going to damage all of our pastures. If we kind of come around in our rotation, hopefully you're rotationally grazing, we come around and there's no regrowth in those pastures, the best thing we can do is put those animals in the dry lot and start to feed some hay before they damage the rest of our pastures. And then when that rain comes, you are going to have a very fast recovery in that pasture. Now the flip side of this coin is that pastures that were kind of marginally managed prior to the drought, so maybe I've got, a high stocking rate. Now fertilizer has been kind of expensive, so I haven't put any fertilizer on my pastures or lime lately, and I'm just kind of putting all the animals in one big pasture and not bothering rotating them. Those pastures are going to be slower to come back in the spring for sure. So you've got to kind of do a mental picture of where you're at on that spectrum and think a little bit about that. So those pastures that really got hammered last summer, so when when things got dry and forage didn't regrow, I didn't take the animals out and they grazed it right down into the soil. That's going to open that sod up. You're going to have more winter annual weed problems this spring. And you're probably going to need to think about how I'm going to manage those pastures as we move into this spring and summer. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. And there's no 100% answer. So every farm will be a little bit different. And you've got to kind of take all these pieces that we're going to talk about and put them together into a plan for your particular situation. I always like when we talk about pasture renovation to talk about why we lose stands of forage. And often we think of too much or not enough water as the primary reason, right? So we had a drought and that drought killed my pasture. Not always. There's a lot of secondary things that impacts how a pasture responds to a drought. So if I wasn't doing those things that we talked about earlier, rotating my pastures, making sure my fertility was good, not grazing too close, and then in my pastures were really weak going into that drought's kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back. So I've got all these other stresses on the pasture, drought comes along, kills the pasture, and we say, well, it's the drought's fault. Well, partially, but not always. A lot of times we have poor fertility in our pastures, need lime or fertilizer, poor grazing management. Probably is the single biggest part of making an improved drought management plan is having good grazing management. If we have good grazing management, we're going to have a healthy stand, we're going to have a strong root system, and that's going to be able to persist through that drought. Poor mowing management in hay fields. So what do I mean by that? Probably the worst thing that's ever happened to orchard grass stands is the invention of the disc mower. We can cut so close with a disc mower, we can take it off right almost at the soil surface. And something like orchard grass especially can't handle that, especially as we're moving into summer. the best thing we can do for hay fields is raise that cutting height a little bit. If we get that cutting height up to about 4 inches or so, we're going to have faster regrowth, and that pasture is going to be more, that hay field will be more persistent, especially as we move into the summer months. Poor choice of forage species. So we always want to grow something that's adapted. You know, we open up a trade publication and we see a advertisement for a clover or for a grass that grows well in South Dakota, but we're not in South Dakota, right? We're in Western Kentucky. So we've got to choose things that we know grow here. And when we try to grow things that aren't well adapted, now they'll grow for a little bit, but they don't persist long term. So our best choice, of course, is nothing new. It's tall fescue. And that's the backbone of our forage systems in Kentucky, and will continue to be the backbone of our forage systems. So you can moan and complain about tall fescue, but at the end of the day, that grass has weaned more calves than any other grass that we have. And we just need to learn how to manage it better within grazing systems. Weed infestations, and I have a question mark behind that because we often say, well, the weeds took my pasture over, the weeds killed my pasture. Often weeds are a symptom of something else that's gone wrong in your management plan. So a lot of times when we graze too closely or our stocking rate's too high, we're going to keep that grass grazed real low. That's going to weaken the grass. It's going to open that sod up. And where there's a hole in the sod, what happens? Something grows there, right? And usually it's something we don't want. So good grazing management is really important, and weeds are often a symptom rather than the problem. Sometimes we get insects, and there's not a lot we can do about insects in most grazing situations. And then we get disease, and we see disease every year, especially in orchard grass hay fields. Brown stripe we'll see. I'd like to tell you that there's something we can spray, but forages in general are a low-value crop. And we're just not going to see a lot of products labeled for forage crops. I can already tell you what our pathologist is going to tell you when she sees a test come back from the lab and it's got a disease. Cut the forage and remove it. That's the general recommendation. So the point that I want to make with this slide is that it's not just usually one thing that kills a pasture, but it's multiple stresses. And then the drought comes along, and it's kind of like that straw that breaks the camel's back. So whenever we talk about pasture renovation, we often think of replanting the pasture. And really, that's kind of down on the bottom of the list when we talk about renovation. There's lots of other things that we need to do prior to actually going in and replanting a pasture. In my younger days, I was much more apt to recommend a complete renovation, but the older I get, you know, I think just working with management and fertility and overseeding pastures is probably the way to go rather than killing and trying to reestablish. There is times when you would want to kill and reestablish a pasture, and one example would be if I was going to incorporate a novel endophyte tall fescue into a grazing system. I really want to make sure that all the toxic tall fescue plants are out of that pasture before I invest in that seed. Okay, when we talk about pasture renovation program, we really need to think about it from an integrated approach. And it starts with things like soil fertility, and then thinking about how grazing management works into that plan. So we don't often think about grazing management as part of pasture renovation, but it's a very important part. Changing what went wrong, identifying what went wrong, why I lost that pasture, and then changing that behavior is really important. Weed control, if I've got a lot of perennial weeds in my pasture, we certainly want to clean those up before we establish something new, especially if we're going to overseed our pastures with a legume like red clover or white clover. And then overseeding legumes, and I think the last couple of years have really showed us the value of legumes in grazing systems. With the nitrogen prices and nitrogen approaching $1 a pound, the value of legumes are really important in sustainable grassland ecosystems. They've always been important, but as fertilizer prices go up, they become even more important. And I hope if you learned anything from the high fertilizer prices, you know, if we can do things to decouple ourselves from commercial fertilizer in grassland agriculture, that's going to be good for our bottom line. And legumes are an important part of that. And we'll talk about that. And then the last thing on my list is reseeding. So that should be our last resort, is doing a complete renovation. So let's just talk real quick about soil fertility. And this is nothing new. I'm reminding you of basic concepts here. I'm not telling you anything new. And I always like to start with Liebig's law of the minimum. And what Liebig's law of the minimum says is that whatever the most limiting essential plant growth factor, that's going to limit overall production. That's a really important agronomic principle, not just for forages, but for any crop that we're growing. So whatever is the most limiting nutrient in a soil fertility program, that's going to hold overall yield back. So that's why we soil test, right? We try to figure out what's limiting, and then we apply that nutrient. We could go to the co-op and get a triple 17 or a triple 19 and put it on our pasture, but chances are we're putting phosphorus on when we don't need it, or potash when we don't need it. The best approach is just to get a good soil test. Lots of different essential plant growth factors, and whatever's the most limiting is going to limit overall production. I like to think of it as kind of the barrel example. So each stave in the barrel can be a different nutrient or essential plant growth factor. Whatever that lowest stave is, that's going to limit how much water you can put in that barrel, right? I can pour as much water as I want in there, but whatever that most limiting stave is, that's going to limit overall pasture production. The point that I'm trying to make is that when we talk about soil fertility and grazing systems, we can't just pick and choose nutrients to apply. We've got to identify what's limiting and then apply that nutrient so that we'll get optimal production from that pasture. I put this slide in here because I think it's really important. A lot of people don't understand how many nutrients are removed when we make a ton of hay. If we take, for example, orchard grass, you know, we're removing around 50 pounds of nitrogen per ton of hay, about 17 pounds of P2O5, and about 62 pounds of K2O. That doesn't sound too bad, but then I have a good year and I produce 3 tons of orchard grass per acre. All of a sudden I'm removing 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I'm removing around 50 some pounds of P2O5, and I'm removing somewhere around 180 pounds of potash. I know Graham can look at a soil test and almost always tell you if it was from a hay field, right? Because potash is almost always low in hay fields. We almost never put enough potash on to replace what we're removing in hay. So remember, when you're thinking about fertilizing your hay field, get a soil test and make sure you're putting enough potash on. That's almost always the limiting nutrient. So those nutrients in hay also have value, right? So if I assume in 1 ton of hay I've got 30 pounds of nitrogen, so it's a little bit less than the previous one, but I'm assuming that the hay's not quite as good a quality, so it's going to be a little fewer nutrients. I've got 30 pounds of nitrogen, 12 pounds of P2O5, and 50 pounds of potash in there. And these are the costs that I'm assuming. And nitrogen has come down. I think it's around 68 cents a pound now if you look at urea, its current cost. But for this example, we use $1. That's what it's been for about the last year and a half or so. 57 cents for P2O5 and 70 cents for K2O. Every ton of hay is going to have somewhere around $70 worth of nutrients in it. At the current fertilizer prices, it's probably closer to $58 or $60 per ton. The point that I'm making is if you have the opportunity to buy hay and bring it into your grazing system, you not only get the value of that hay as a feed source, which can vary, right, depending on how it's been made, but you're also bringing those nutrients in. So it's kind of like getting a coupon along with that hay. So I'm paying $100 a ton and I'm getting $60 worth of nutrients. That's not too bad of a deal in many cases. And for small and medium-sized beef operations, buying hay instead of making it yourself may be a really good economic choice if you can buy decent hay. So So those nutrients that we talked about in the ton of hay that are worth somewhere between, say, $60 and $70, they're only worth that if you get them distributed on the pasture uniformly, right? So if I take all my hay and I feed it in one little corner of one field that's close to the gate, am I capturing the value of those nutrients? No, because I'm concentrating them all in one spot. We'd never pull a fertilizer buggy into a pasture and spread all the fertilizer in one corner of the pasture, would we? Maybe Brandon would. But most of us wouldn't, right? So the point that I want to make is that to capture the value of those nutrients in that hay, we've got to spread those hay feeding points out. And you can do it different ways. It doesn't really matter how you do it. But somehow you got to move that hay around. You can unroll it. You can set bales out in different places. You can feed a bale here and then move the feeder over here and feed a bale. You can use a bale wagon, but somehow getting those nutrients or those hay feeding points distributed over the pasture area is what you need to do to get the best distribution of nutrients. One of the most beautiful things about a well-managed cow-calf system is that if we do a good job with our grazing management and a good job with our feeding management, we can build a very strong nutrient cycle. And that makes cow-calf systems very unique. So we have inputs that come in terms of nutrients and things like fertilizer and manure if we bring any litter or manure onto our pastures. Legumes like clover bring nitrogen into the grazing system. Anything that we feed, minerals, commodity feeds like Katie was talking about, hay, they're all bringing nutrients into the system and they get cycled around this system. So the animals eat these plants or the feed, and then what do? They use some of those nutrients, but most of the nutrients go back out, right? About 80 to 90% of the nutrients that go in the front end of the animal come out the back end of the animal or below it, right? So we're getting a lot of nutrients moving back onto that pasture. And in the cow-calf system are really our only exporter calves, right? And then some cull cows. So very few nutrients are moving out of that system. John Laurie at University of Missouri figured there's about 7 pounds of phosphorus, about 10 pounds of nitrogen, and about a pound of potash taken out of the grazing system by a cow-calf pair annually. So not a lot of nutrient removal. That's one of the things that makes a well-managed cow-calf system so sustainable long-term. Now, what can happen in a grazing system is that they can redistribute nutrients. So if I have one big boundary here, I got a big pasture, maybe 60 or 80 acres, and the cows come out here and they graze, and then where do they go? They go back to what? Shade and water, right? Gets hot, and they go down, lay down, ruminate, maybe get a drink of water, cool themselves off in the pond. They get up to go back out, what happens? Well, they make a deposit like going to the bank, right? And over time, we're going to move nutrients from here to here and concentrate them around things like shade and water and minerals, or maybe where we feed some commodity feed at, but anywhere where animals congregate at, they're going to concentrate nutrients. So how do we manage that in the grazing system? Well, we subdivide our pastures and we start to rotate. So we put animals out here and they're eating here, and they say, well, instead of putting your manure back over here by the trees, go ahead and put it back in this paddock. And that's essentially what managed grazing is doing. We're improving nutrient distribution within the grazing system. The smaller we make those paddocks, the more often we rotate them, the better our nutrient distribution is going to be within the grazing system. It's not perfect. It's not like spreading fertilizer on your pasture with a buggy, but it can make a big difference just by managing grazing to how well our nutrients are distributed within that system. I'm not going to belabor this, but we really can't manage something that we don't have data on, and that's what soil testing does for us. It gives us data to start to manage the fertility within our grazing system. And we quantify phosphorus and potassium mainly with a soil test. We don't really measure nitrogen, and it provides us the baseline. Otherwise, we're just kind of guessing what to put on that pasture. And this soil testing is so important, but it's even more important when fertilizer prices are high, because it allows you to target fertilizer applications and put on just what you need. Not any more, not any less, not extra phosphorus, not extra potassium or nitrogen, just what you need. And then we want to just track our soil fertility over time. You don't have to soil sample a pasture every year, but every 2 to 3 years would be good. And then it allows you to kind of track what's happening within that grazing system. So just remember the test, whether it's a hay test or whether it's a soil test, only as good as the sample represents the pasture. So we've got to get a good representative sample. And this is just some instructions for that. The biggest thing to remember when you're sampling pastures that's different than row crop fields is that you want to really avoid atypical areas. So areas where animals congregate at. Feed, water, mineral, shade. So avoid those areas. If you include those areas in your soil sample, you'll elevate the overall test results and it won't be representative of the majority of the pasture area. So with the high fertilizer prices, really our best option right now is to put on lime if we need lime. Lime has gone up some because of trucking and so forth, but not as much as fertilizer. In soil acidity is still a major factor in limiting forage production, just not in Kentucky, but the whole southeastern United States. And it does several things. It reduces the availability of other nutrients in the soil, and it reduces nitrogen fixation in legumes. So liming neutralizes that soil acidity and supplies some calcium and magnesium. Generally speaking, if we're in that range of 6 to 6.4, we're in pretty good shape for most pasture situations and pasture species. Now, the exception would be if you're grazing alfalfa or you're making alfalfa hay, then we want to be up 6.5 to 7. So I just put this up here to show you the impact the pH has on the plant availability of different nutrients in the soil. Each one of these bands are a different nutrient. The wider the band, the more plant available it is. If we look in this range where we want to be, in that 6 to 7, so it's, if we go to this side of the diagram, this is really acid, this side's really alkaline. We want to be in this range of 6 to 7. That's when all of our macronutrients, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, are all the most plant available. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this so that you understand that lime's a good investment, not just for changing the soil acidity, but for increasing the availability of other nutrients in the soil to plants. And right now, it's probably our best buy. If you need lime, it's a good time to put lime on. Don't just put it on haphazardly. Base your lime recommendation and lime applications off of a soil test. Talk just a little bit about grazing management. And grazing management's all about helping these guys make the right decision. Sometimes they don't make good decisions by themselves, just like our kids do sometimes. So, rotational grazing. So, we're doing two things with rotational grazing. We're managing residual leaf area, so that's how close they graze that pasture. And the other thing we're managing is carbohydrate reserves in that plant. So that's carbohydrate reserves are stored energy in that plant. And plants use that stored energy for regrowth after stressful events. After they go through a winter dormancy, after they go through a drought stress, they need energy to regrow with. So having a good store of carbohydrates in that plant is important for that plant to make it through and recover from stresses. And then the last thing that we can do with rotational grazing, it's really a powerful tool to manage botanical composition in pastures. I'll just give you a quick example. So say for example, I had a mixture of tall fescue and Bermuda grass in my pasture. Not an uncommon mixture. We commonly find that in a lot of pastures in this area of the state. Say I wanted more summer grazing in that particular pasture. One thing I can do is graze that pasture closer, especially in late spring and early summer. and that will help to release that Bermuda grass in that mixture. So just by how we manage grazing, how frequently, how close, we can change the botanical composition of that pasture. Grazing management's really a powerful tool that can have a significant impact on botanical composition, or the plants that are dominant in that pasture. So I just want to mention implementing rotational stocking, and I guess the most important thing is that you have to go into it with the right attitude. Don't do it because I told you to do it or Graham told you to do it. Do it because you want to do it. If you go into it and say, well, this is never going to work, chances of you being successful are pretty slim. You're going to have roadblocks, and you're going to have droughts and floods and so forth. But if you've got the right attitude, you'll kind of find your way around those problems. So a key part of rotational grazing is having water, and that's really critical. Without water sources in pastures, it's very hard to implement a rotational stocking. Do we have anybody from NRCS here today? No? All right. NRCS has got some great programs, the EQIP program for installing waters in pastures and subdividing pastures. If you're considering improved grazing management, I would definitely consider using some of those programs to help speed that process up. And if you're a new farmer, they can be a very good deal. So again, we're managing that how closely that pasture's grazed, and then how long that pasture's rested. And that's going to improve not only productivity of that pasture. In fact, when you switch from a continuous to rotational stocking system, you'll improve productivity by about 30%. It's also going to improve drought tolerance. And we don't think about grazing management as a drought, improving our drought tolerance in pastures, but it does. When somebody switches from a continuous to a rotational system, the first thing they notice is that their pastures grow longer into a drought stress and come out of that drought stress faster. And that has to do with what's below the ground. If I have a continuously stocked pasture, it never gets above the height of this table. The root system of that plant is going to be pretty small, and that's going to make that pasture much more susceptible to drought stress. If I graze it and I leave 4 to 5 inches in that pasture and I move to another pasture, when that pasture undergoes a drought stress, it's got a bigger root system that's going to be able to find more water in that soil. And when it comes out of that, the rain comes and it comes out of that drought stress, it's going to come back faster because it's got good energy stores and it's got a little bit of leaf area left in that pasture. So, rotational grazing is just not a drought management strategy. It's probably one of our most important ones to think about as we think about a whole farm drought management plan. Again, we talked about nutrient cycles. So when we implement rotational stocking, we're subdividing big pastures into smaller ones, and we're getting a more uniform nutrient distribution. And we're also able to manage botanical composition by how close and how frequently we graze those pastures. So a lot of people get scared away from rotational grazing because they think they need to subdivide their farm into 24 pastures and move animals every 12 hours. You don't have to do that. Most of you can implement a rotational stocking system by simply closing a gate on the pasture. That's an easy way to get started. And then you'll start to see the benefit of that, and hopefully you'll subdivide some of those bigger pastures into smaller ones. What I always tell people is that when you think about designing a rotational grazing system, make sure you build flexibility into that system. That system has got to meet your wants and needs. If you're somebody that works off the farm, wants to move animals once a week on Saturdays, then build your system so that you're moving your animals once a week. So, and build flexibility into your system. And the most important part of a grazing system is going to be where you put those waters. So when you install those waters, don't install them just for today. Install them for maybe subdividing that pasture into 2 in 6 months or a year or 2 years down the road. It takes a little bit of time to think that through, but people like Graham can help you figure that out and help you figure out where the best place is to put that water that will let you have flexibility in how you manage that pasture in the future. Just mentioned weed control in pastures, and J.D. Green has a really nice publication on, has photographs of the different weeds, and then on the back it tells you what herbicides are effective on that weed, and most importantly, when to apply those herbicides. We'd like to apply herbicides once a year and kill all of our weeds, but it just doesn't work like that, right? You have to hit those plants when they're actively growing and most susceptible to those herbicides. What's the definition of a weed? It's easy in a row crop, right, Brandon? Yeah, anything you didn't plant in that row crop field is going to be a weed, right? Pastures is not quite as clear. The definition I like for a pasture is something the cow won't eat. If it won't eat it, then it's truly a weed in a pasture. If you try to eradicate every weed from your pasture, you're going to lose your mind. You'll never do it. So you got to kind of find that balance between having some weeds and having a good productive pasture. We always assume that weeds are low in nutritional value. This is some work that Ozzie Abay did at Virginia Tech. She just took some weeds at different growth stages when they were immature and looked at digestibility, acid detergent fiber, and crude protein. What's interesting is she put it against alfalfa. So the digestibility of alfalfa was 72%. Red root pigweed was 73% when it was vegetative. So we always think about weeds of being poor quality, but they're poor quality when they're 4 feet tall. If we have a rotational stocking system and we're keeping some of those weeds grazed down, the quality can be actually pretty decent on some of these weedy forbs. Now they are lower in productivity, and I think that's important to point out. If you have too many weeds, you're displacing a really productive forage with something that's lower in productivity. So we don't want to have too many weeds in our pastures, but a few's probably not the end of the world. So just to mention control of weeds in pastures, and we talked about how weeds are often thought of as taking a pasture over, but really they're kind of a symptom of a bigger problem. And that problem is probably related to grazing management and fertility management and so forth. So they're a symptom rather than a problem itself. And the good Lord never leaves bare soil in a pasture. Something's going to grow there. So if there's a spot, something's going to grow there, and usually that Band-Aid to heal that soil up is going to be a weed. So again, we have to think about weed control from an integrated approach. And soil fertility, forage species that we choose, grazing management, and then the judicial use of herbicides. Our first go-to every time when we have weeds in our pastures to do what? We go to the co-op and we say, what do you got that's going to kill this weed? And man, we've got some great herbicides, right? We've got Grazon next, we've got Duracor, and they're going to kill weeds dead. What do you have when you kill a weed in a pasture? A dead spot. What grows in an open spot in a pasture? Another weed. So the point is that you have to have kind of an integrated approach when you think about weed control in pastures. Just kind of want to wrap things up and talk a little bit about overseeding legumes in pastures. And this is going to be a really important part of a sustainable grassland ecosystem. So if I can reduce the amount of commercial fertilizer I need in a cow-calf production system, that's going to be a good thing. And legumes are one of the tools that you can get there to help build a strong nitrogen cycle within that grazing system. So as everybody knows, legumes take nitrogen, they form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria, form nodules on the root, like in this photograph, and they take nitrogen from the air. What percent of the air is nitrogen gas? 78, very good. Yeah, right on. It's a miracle. You guys witnessed it tonight. 78% nitrogen, but that nitrogen is not available to the plant. So forming this symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria, the bacteria fix that nitrogen into a plant available form and share it with that legume plant. In return, the legume plant provides that bacteria with an energy source in the form of sugars fixed during photosynthesis. So legumes are going to increase yields. They're going to improve forage quality and animal performance. They're going to improve summer growth if we have something with a deep taproot like Sericea lespedeza or alfalfa will have improved drought tolerance in a grazing system. And then they dilute the endophyte in tall fescue, so they're an important part of our strategy for managing tall fescue in grazing systems. Interestingly enough, they do more than just dilute tall fescue, the toxins in tall fescue. They actually reverse, in some cases, the negative impact of those toxins produced by the endophyte in the animal. So in the animal, when the animals are exposed to hot fescue or toxic fescue, the endophyte makes a set of compounds called ergodalkaloids. They cause vasoconstriction in the animal, so the vascular system gets smaller. And the way a cow cools itself is it pumps blood to the skin, and that heat kind of radiates off the skin. Well, you can imagine in the summertime, when it's hot and those blood vessels get smaller, it has a harder time cooling itself. So animals under tall fescue toxicosis are running a low-grade fever all summer long. They just don't feel good. They don't eat as much, and the gains are lower on those. The compound in red clover, there's a class of compounds called isoflavones, and those are vasodilators. So where the toxins in tall fescue cause the vascular system to shrink in the animal, the vasodilators cause it to get bigger again. So it's more than just a dilution effect. It's actually having a physiological effect on the animal. And red clover has been shown to be the highest in the vasodilators. So legumes fix nitrogen, and I just put this up here to put a value on that nitrogen. And we've been in the last couple of years closer to $1 than 50 cents for a pound of nitrogen. And this is just a value. So alfalfa is going to be our most aggressive nitrogen fixer, 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. Ladino clover will be down in that 75 to 150 pounds. So the value of that nitrogen is going to be somewhere between 75 and 150 or 250 dollars per acre per year. That's a pretty big deal when nitrogen price is high. And if we can work to encourage legumes in our pastures and maintain legumes in our pastures, we're going to reduce our need for nitrogen fertilizer in a grazing system and improve forage quality and yield within that grazing system. Now, one thing to remember is that the animal is a really important part of sharing this nitrogen. So a legume plant and a grass plant are beside each other in a pasture, but there's not a lot of direct sharing going on. It's not like the legume plant saying, hey buddy, you need some nitrogen, I'll give you a little bit. It's really cycled indirectly, and the animal is an important part of that cycle. So the animal eats that legume plant, it goes through its digestive system, it comes out, most of the nitrogen in the urine of the plant, and that's how the grass plant gets that nitrogen. And over time, this system kind of builds upon itself, and we develop a strong nitrogen cycle in well-managed grazing systems. So how do we get legumes back into pastures? And I just want to mention a couple ways. We're going to go through a series of steps, and before I forget, I'm just going to show you this. Don't leave here without getting one of these publications. Brand new, and it's a great publication on frost-eating clover in pastures. Step by step, it's 3 pages, bulleted, and if you don't even want to read 3 pages, just look at this blue box that's got all the important points in that blue box. So grab one of those. Graham, don't let them leave without it. So the first step when I think about getting legumes back into pastures is that I need to suppress that existing sod and reduce residue, because that lets that seed get to the soil surface. So it's going to improve soil to seed contact, and for a legume seed to germinate, we've got to have good soil to seed contact. It's going to reduce the vigor of that sod, which is going to reduce shading of those seedlings after the legume germinates. And this is best accomplished with grazing, with hard grazing prior to frost seeding or prior to drilling clover into your pastures in the spring. We can clip pastures, but it's just not as good as really getting in there and grazing them pretty hard. And that kind of fits well in with stockpiling tall fescue and then kind of grazing that stockpile fescue off with little strips across the field to get good utilization. Plus, you open that stand up for frost seeding. So, second step is to get good soil to seed contact. And there's a number of different techniques for getting good soil to seed contact. We can frost seed, we can no-till seed with a no-till drill, we can use minimum tillage where we do disturb some of the pasture sod, maybe 40 or 50%, and then broadcast the seed on to get better soil to seed contact. A lot of people will talk in some trade publications about livestock seeding, but it just doesn't work that well, but I wanted to mention it. Just don't do it. In livestock seeding is when I would mix that seed with a feed or a mineral and the animals would eat that, and then it would pass through the gastrointestinal tract of the animal and out the other end, and hopefully some of those seeds live. Some will, some won't. But what we know won't live is rhizobium bacteria on those seeds that we inoculate legume seeds with. So just don't do that, and we don't get good seed distribution with this either. We're much better off to frost seed than do livestock seeding. Regardless of what method you choose, the goal is always the same. You want to get that seed in contact with the soil so it can germinate, come up, and produce a viable seedling. So the first one I want to talk about, and probably our lowest investment one and easiest for everybody in this room to do, is going to be frost seeding. And all we do is graze that pasture tight in the fall and winter, and then we come on about this time of year, and we broadcast that seed onto the soil surface. And then the freezing and the thawing that happens causes little cracks to form in the soil and incorporates that seed into the soil surface where it can germinate and produce a viable seedling. Works best with red and white clover, doesn't work as well with grasses and legumes. So really you need some kind of soil disturbance, or grasses and alfalfa. Alfalfa is best no-till seeded grasses. You need some type of either no-till seeding or soil disturbance to get them in good contact with the soil. And again, preparation starts, last year. You want to control weeds, soil test and adjust fertility, and then reduce the residue and vigor of that sod with hard grazing prior to frost seeding. So just some key points for success, and they're all in that publication that I showed you. You want to reduce the amount of plant residue. You want to make sure you get it on in a timely manner. So don't wait to the end of the period. Get it on early so there's lots of freezing and thawing cycles going on to incorporate that seed. You want to make sure you get it on, and you want to make sure that you control post-seeding competition. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's kind of our last step. You want to use high quality seed. Now, red clover comes a different couple of ways. You can buy either a medium red clover, variety not stated, or you can buy an improved variety, or you can buy a certified red clover seed. Probably one of our best red clover varieties, and it's not new at all, is Cattlemen. And Cattlemen was bred at the University of Kentucky, so it's really well adapted to our conditions here. And Cattlemen is a public variety, and it comes two ways, certified or non-certified. And we did some testing at the University of Kentucky of the Cattlemen non-certified and Cattlemen certified, and the non-certified produced 30% less than the certified seed. When it's non-certified, there's no guarantee of what you're getting in that bag. Well, the guarantee is it's probably not Cattlemen in that bag. So make sure if you're going to use Cattlemen, make sure and get certified seed. Otherwise, use an approved variety of red clover. There's a number of them on the market. White clover, make sure you use a ladino. That's a large white clover. It produces 3 to 5 times as much dry matter and has a higher growth habit in pastures. Don't use Dutch white clover because it grows very close to the soil surface and is not productive. Make sure you use good quality seed. Use the correct seeding rate, so calibrate your little spreader. And make sure you get even seed distribution. That's often easier to say than done, right? So I'm running across the pasture with my ATV spreading seed. that's kind of hard to see where I just was unless it just snowed. And that's kind of where this comes in. These are pretty simple, and the row crop guys have used these for, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years maybe. But you can buy these little units now for $1,200, put them on a four-wheeler, and then you'll be able to see where you've driven in that pasture. And we did a little study at the research station, nothing high-tech. We just frost seeded some pastures, and we initiated GPS guidance, and then we covered it with a bag. Right? And Brandon's laughing at me.
We use that on our hay rake this year.
On your hay rake? Yeah.
When we were raking hay, we needed to guide it so we knew where we'd be.
Yeah. It sounds like you need some improved management on your hay crop.
Yeah.
So we covered it with a bag, and then I had two technicians go out, and they drove 4 pastures. They ranged in size between 5 and 10 acres. And I said, drive every 30 feet. And then we did the same thing, except we let them use guidance for the second round. And these were the 2 drivers. We had a Murray State graduate and a graduate of North Carolina State University. It's not a competition, but one did clearly better than the other. So this was the results. So this was the amount of overlap in 2019 and 2021 with no guidance and then with guidance. So what I want to point out in 2019 is that our driver had a 50% overlap. In 2021, they had a 21% overlap. And this was clearly the winner, our North Carolina State graduate. She had, with no guidance, 21% overlap. So the point that I want to make here is that when we average across these 2 years, we had about a 35% overlap. That adds up fast when we're talking about seeding clover and pastures. So this little unit will pay for itself in probably 200 or 200 to 300 acres of overseeding pastures. This is just what the diagram looked like. This was with one pasture with no guidance. Kind of got lost up here in this part of the pasture and had a lot of overlap. Same pasture, same driver, GPS guidance. Just want to mention minimum tillage for frost seeding or for overseeding pastures. And this is when we go in and we graze it hard just like we normally would, and then we disturb somewhere between 40 and 60% of the sod. Light disking or some type of tillage tool, or I don't know, the row crop guys know what to use. But the goal is to get some soil disturbance so that you get better soil to seed contact. And then you broadcast your seed on, and ideally you would come back and drag it or use a cultipacker to press it in contact with that soil. And this can actually give very good results for overseeding pastures. And probably is the preferred method if you're going to mix a grass and a legume together to try to thicken that pasture up. And then, of course, we want to control competition, which we'll talk about in a minute. The last method I want to mention is a no-till drill, and this is takes more effort and attention to detail, but you're actually putting that seed in contact with the soil. So you're not counting on freezing or thawing to get that seed in contact with the soil. And so you can get some pretty consistent results with this if you do it right. In Beth's method for interseeding alfalfa, remember we always start out the same: suppress the sod and reduce the residue by hard grazing. Make sure you calibrate your drill. I know that sounds silly, but I can't tell you how many people will come up after a meeting and say, you know, I was overseeding my pasture with white clover and red clover, and you know, you're only putting down 6 or 7 pounds an acre, and if you're a couple pounds off with 6 or 7 pounds per acre, then it's a substantial amount. So take the time and calibrate. We have a really simple way to do this. It's universal across drills. It's based on the space between the disc opener and then how much seed you're putting down. And it tells you how many grams of seed to catch per disc opener. And all you need is a little scale to do this and some baggies to collect the seed in. There's a nice video on our website on drill calibration, probably one of our most watched videos, and the star of it is great. So it's worth watching. It's about 10 or 12 minutes, and if you're going to calibrate a drill, it's definitely worth watching. And it's worth it to take that half an hour and calibrate that drill to make sure you're putting out the right amount of seed. So we're coming towards the end here, so hang in with me. Check and recheck your seeding depth. Probably the biggest mistake that we make with the no-till drill is putting the seed too deep. We can put seed 2 inches deep, and if I put a tiny clover seed that's as big as the tip of a pencil 2 inches deep, it's not coming up. So check and recheck your seeding depth. You never want to seed small seeded forages deeper than about 1/2 of an inch. A good general rule is if you don't see a little bit of seed beside that drill slit, you're probably going too deep with that seed. And this is a couple interns checking some seeding depth on an on-farm demo somewhere in western Kentucky. And then control competition after seeding. And that brings us to our last step, and that's controlling that post-seeding competition. A lot of times this is where a frost seeding will fail at. We fail to control competition after we frost seed it, after those clover plants germinate and they start to come up. They're really susceptible to competition for light. And probably one of the best things we can do after we frost seed a pasture is leave the animals on it and feed a little bit of hay in that pasture. They're going to walk some seed in and they're going to nip that sod down, so when it starts to grow in the spring, they'll be right there to keep it grazed down and allow those clover to germinate, come up, and produce a viable seedling. And you're saying, well, they're going to walk on those seedlings or they're going to graze some of those seedlings off, and that's absolutely true. But if you don't control that competition, you're going to lose all those seedlings to lack of light. Often determines the success or failure of that stand. And once seedlings get up to that 4 to 6 inch height, just put that pasture back in your normal rotation. All right, so here's my last slide, my pasture resurrection checklist. Just soil, checking just soil fertility according to soil test. Choose adapted forage species and good varieties. Implement rotational stocking. Control broadleaf weeds prior to frost seeding clover, of course. Incorporate legumes into grazing systems and then manage that grazing system for those legumes. And then reseed pastures as a last resort. And I'll leave you with this parting thought, is that we live in a world today where we like everything to be instantaneous. I don't even like to leave a message on Brandon's phone when I call him. I like for him to pick it up so I can talk to him. And we've gotten very impatient. In pasture renovation and pasture management is something that takes time. So figure out what you want to do, make yourself a plan, and then stick to it. And you're going to see big improvements in your pastures, but not in a month or two. Those improvements are going to come in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years down the road. So we just have to be patient and keep on course and keep with our plan. And I'll leave it there. Is there any questions? Everybody wants to go home, and I don't blame you. So if there's no questions, you're welcome to ask them now. I'll be around, and you can ask me any question you want. You got to have a question, Brandon.